welcome to this explainer. Today, we are embarking on a profoundly deep spiritual journey right through Psalms 91 to 95. Together, we're going to explore some absolutely magnificent themes, things like providence, divine protection, and what true worship of our Creator actually looks like. So if you've ever felt overwhelmed by the chaos of the world and just really sought a deeper understanding of God's plan for His people, you are in exactly the right place. Let's explore this together.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be stepping chronologically through 5 beautiful chapters: Psalm chapter 91, Psalm chapter 92, Psalm chapter 93, Psalm chapter 94, and Psalm chapter 95.
All right, let's dive right into our first stop, Psalm chapter 91, the safest refuge. Opening up Psalm chapter 91, this text tackles exactly where we can find a completely safe refuge in a world that is just overflowing with fear and unseen dangers. It's so fascinating to look at Psalm 91, verses 1 and 2, where we discover 2 powerful Hebrew names for God, Elyon and Shaddai, which translate to the Most High and the Almighty. Now, think about the harsh, scorching heat of the ancient Middle East for a second. Finding a shadow out there wasn't just nice, it was literally a lifesaver. Dwelling under God's shadow here acts as a divine shield that preserves our lives. It wonderfully establishes that our Creator is the supreme authority and all-powerful protector. But the psalmist makes it deeply personal, saying, "My refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." We really have to claim Him as our own. Now, what's really fascinating here is this sudden shift in voice. Towards the end of the chapter in Psalm 91, verses 14 through 16, instead of the psalmist speaking about God, the text shifts completely to God's direct oracle. God personally promises deliverance to those who deeply know Him. It's a beautiful realization, honestly. He doesn't promise us this perfect little vacuum free of any trouble. Rather, He promises to be right there in the very midst of the trouble with us. But listen, God's promise of salvation and protection isn't just automatic. It actually requires a deeply personal relationship based on 3 specific conditions. First, we've got to hold fast to Him in love. Second, we must know His name personally. And this isn't just intellectual knowledge like memorizing facts. It's an intimate, experiential knowledge of our Creator. And third, we must call to Him in prayer. When we meet these conditions, He assures us, absolutely guarantees, that He will step directly into our troubles, deliver us, and show us His eternal salvation. Moving right along to Psalm chapter 92, the joy of Sabbath praise. This chapter is actually a magnificent psalm specifically written for the Sabbath day. It's designed to build our joy as we intentionally pause to meditate on God's creation and His perfect providence. In Psalm 92, verses 1 through 3, we are invited to frame our entire day with 2 beautiful concepts: God's Hesed in the morning and His Emunah at night. Hesed is God's unchanging, covenantal love, which we should be declaring the very moment we wake up. And Emunah is His absolute faithfulness, which we recount before we go to sleep. It's an incredible thing to think about, really. By recognizing His love at the start of the day and His faithfulness at the end, we create this constant, joyful rhythm of worship that completely anchors our soul in God's plan. Have you ever found it confusing or maybe even frustrating to see the wicked prospering in the world? We've all been there, right? Well, this brilliantly illustrates a powerful contrast found a bit later in the chapter. The psalmist tells us in Psalm 92, verse 7, that the wicked might temporarily sprout up like shallow grass, growing super quickly, but withering almost instantly under the hot sun of God's judgment. In stark contrast, verses 12 through 14 show us that the righteous are firmly planted in the Lord's house. Because their roots are deep in God's presence, they flourish eternally, just like the famously strong cedar trees of Lebanon, bearing fruit even in old age. Now we step into Psalm chapter 93, God's eternal reign. As we move into Psalm chapter 93, our perspective zooms way, way out. We go from personal devotion to this grand, cosmic view of God's enthronement. Psalm 93, verse 1 boldly declares, Yahweh Malach, the Lord reigns. This isn't just some quiet observation, it is a massive cosmic declaration of God's coronation. Discovering this plants a deep, unshakable conviction in us. Because He wears the robes of majesty and arms Himself with strength, the world is firmly established by His providence. No matter how wildly unstable human empires become, God's sovereign rule is completely unshakable. Okay, here's an amazing historical nugget for you.
In the ancient world, raging floods and roaring seas heavily symbolized the forces of evil and chaos rising up against divine order. But Psalm 93, verses 3 and 4, promises us something totally incredible. Even when the floods lift up their roaring, when life feels completely out of control, the Lord on high is far mightier than any chaotic storm or wave that threatens us. Before the Creator, the most terrifying earthly threats are merely creatures that have no choice but to bow to His command. That brings us to Psalm chapter 94, a cry for divine justice. In Psalm chapter 94, the tone shifts pretty drastically to an agonizing yet deeply hopeful prayer seeking God's perfect justice. The psalmist cries out in Psalm 94, verse 1, to the God of Nekomot. Now, you might see the word vengeance in some English translations here, but in biblical theology, Nekomot is absolutely not about petty personal revenge. Not at all. It actually represents the execution of divine justice. It is a desperate plea for the true judge of creation to break his silence, execute his perfect justice, and protect the oppressed from the arrogant wicked who somehow think God isn't watching. And this brings us to a crucial reality check for the wicked, found right here in Psalm 94, verse 9. Those plotting evil foolishly think they are hidden in the shadows. But the psalmist asks a brilliant rhetorical question. He who planted the ear, does he not hear? He who formed the eye, does he not see? It is an undeniable, powerful reminder that the omniscient Creator who designed our very senses sees, hears, and knows absolutely everything. No one escapes his perfect vision. Yet for the believer, this chapter offers some profound, enduring comfort. When our feet feel like they are slipping under the heavy weight of earthly injustice, Psalm 94, verses 18 and 19 remind us that God's covenantal love, remember his hesed from chapter 92, that is exactly what holds us up. When our hearts are just filled to the brim with anxiety, it is his divine consolations that truly cheer our souls. He is our ultimate stronghold and our rock of refuge when the world's systems completely fail us. Finally, we arrive at our last stop, Psalm chapter 95, the call to true worship. Our spiritual journey culminates here in Psalm chapter 95, which serves as this powerful, urgent invitation to respond to everything we've just learned about God's providence and justice. Psalm chapter 95 outlines a beautiful three-step progression of what true worship actually looks like in practice. It starts in the first few verses with a loud, joyful shout to our Creator, recognizing him as the rock of our salvation. Then the tone shifts inward to a quiet, humble kneeling and bowing down before our shepherd. And ultimately, it culminates in complete, active obedience to his word. As Psalm 95 verse 7 beautifully puts it, we bow down because we recognize our total dependence on him. We are the fragile sheep of his pasture, fully reliant on his divine guidance for survival. We aren't self-sufficient. We exist entirely by his grace and providence. Kneeling is simply the physical expression of a very real spiritual reality. We literally cannot survive without our shepherd's care. Halfway through verse 7, however, the psalmist shifts to a very stern warning. Actually, God speaks directly here, reminding us in Psalm 95, verses 8 through 11, of the historical Israelites at Meribah and Massah. It's a really sobering reminder. Despite witnessing God's miraculous creation and deliverance firsthand, they grumbled. Because they lacked water in the immediate moment, they hardened their hearts. They tested God, and as a result, they wandered the wilderness for 40 long years. Their ultimate consequence was being denied entry into God's promised rest. Which leaves us with one profoundly challenging question straight from the end of Psalm chapter 95. God emphasizes the word today. Today, as you hear his voice, will you yield to God's plan and enter his eternal rest? Or will you allow the immediate trials of this world to harden your heart? The choice to trust our eternal King and find true refuge under his wings is entirely up to you. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer as we unpacked this incredible journey through the Psalms.